So when I was in the 5th grade, we went to an assembly where we learned about the different kinds of learning styles, and then we went back to our classroom and we all like wrote down a piece of paper what our learning styles were. We passed them into our teacher so she could read them and then, you know, have that help her make our classroom better fit how all of us learned. And my teacher read mine. And she pulled me out into the hallway and she told me that if I wanted to learn the way that I said that I learned, I needed to be homeschooled, so I would just need to figure out how to learn the way that everybody else did. Which is a deeply wild thing to say to a 9-year-old, and we're gonna unpack the effects of that later. But what's interesting to me is that from a teaching perspective, which I technically started doing about 6 years after that moment, I have never once heard these things come up. Ever. Which, like, when I was a kid, they felt like they were all the rage, but then they never appeared in my education classes, and I've never heard a single teacher talk about them, and that got me wondering, like, where did these ideas come from? Were they even a real thing in the first place? Are they still a real thing? Or was it just some like weird education trend that happened to appear all the rage to just sell a lot of new courses or something and then died out almost immediately? So that's what we're gonna find out today. And we're gonna get angry about the education system. Also, if you're new here, hi there, hello. My name is Sydney, pronouns they, them. I am a multi-hyphenate actor, dramaturg, composer, video essayist, disability educator, and theater access reviewer for the purposes of this video. I taught on and off basically from high school to now, and I did my undergrad thesis on accessible education, particularly in the arts, but also more generally, and I made a series on here teaching y'all about how to create accessible classrooms, which I will link up here, and I also sometimes go to schools and universities and I teach professional developments about this stuff, so if you want me to come to your school, please send me an email. I'd be happy to do it. Also, I'm a white person with light brown, just above shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a off-white tank top with a dark blue button up with white flowers on it open on top and sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. So first, obviously, what is a learning style? Basically, this concept is that all people have different kinds of styles that their brain likes to learn that can be categorized into a handful of learning styles. And this can help students to learn to cater their learning towards their learning style to get more out of their education, as well as help teachers come up with different ways to help various students and cater to their learning needs. In 2004, when the British education scholar Frank Caulfield led a review of the relevant research literature, his team identified an astonishing 71 different models or ways of classifying learning styles, and they compiled a wide array of associated journal articles, magazine features, websites, and conference papers, few of which were peer-reviewed or conducted in well-designed studies. We'll get to that. The primary one we're going to focus on today is VARK, because that is the one that plagued my childhood growing up and is the one that's most commonly used, but what we say about VARK is standard across all other similar categories of learning styles. We'll break down what that means shortly. First, let's talk about the history of learning styles. The idea that humans can be broken into specific categories of people based on their personality traits has been around for literally forever. A lot of people point to Aristotle as a source, but Hippocrates in 450 BC came up with the 4 temperaments or 4 humors that described different kinds of people, and these ideas have persisted and been renamed and recreated over and over again for all of humanity. Think about like all the personality tests, the MBTI, whatever the heck, the zodiac signs, all that kind of stuff. This all comes from the same root, which is really funny because I have beef with personality tests too. Who knew we'd have an overlap? These ideas were mostly relegated just to personality traits, but they did at some point shift to be either personality or more focused on brain and thought processes. In the 1760s, we see Rousseau's educational works where he talked about how learning should follow what the child wants to learn and let the child lead their education and grow and explore from there rather than just sticking to texts and books, which ended up branching off into things like the Montessori system. I didn't see Waldorf mentioned anywhere in here, ironically, but I would put it in the same category of education as well. At the same time, we also see a rise of the concept of administering an education via coercion, control, rote memorization, the one-room schoolhouse kind of style. And keep in mind that we did not know that children's brains are not just tiny adult brains until Piaget came around in the late 1930s. So that's a thing. Also around that time, as Piaget, we also got Gordon Allport's work on cognitive styles, explaining how different people think in different ways. So we start to see more of a personality trait situation or personality test situation, but specific to brains. From all of this, we start to see the idea of a learning style appear. There are different dates as to who was the first one to use the term and when, but it seems that the VAC system, which divided learning styles into visual, auditory, or oral, and kinesthetic, was used for learning disabled students from the 1920s to the 1950s. The 1950s is when we see further discussion in more mainstream conversations about the VAC system, and then in the 60s it began to be implemented in many inner city schools to try to close the gap between different students, and then in the 1970s it became popularized and used by general students. We also got the learning style inventory from a guy named David Kolb, which divided styles into the accommodator, who learns in a practical hands-on way, the converger, who thrives in abstract conceptualization, the diverger, who is more imaginative and artistic in nature, and the assimilator, who is interested in planning, research, and creating incorporating theoretical research. For the record, some of the very earliest literature reviews of these teaching methods said it was not very effective as a tool in like the 1920s and 30s, and yet it became even more popular somehow. What? In 1893. In 1983, I'm literate, we get Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences that basically said that rather than just IQ smart intelligence, there are many different kinds of intelligence. They're like linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, bodily, kinesthetic, spatial visual, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. Got it. And then Then in 1987, I'm gonna get better at reading numbers. In 1987, VARC appears from a New Zealand teacher named Neil Fleming. He took VAC and he added reading/writing as a fourth learning style, and he popularized the idea of the meshing hypothesis, basically saying that if teachers catered to a learner's style of receiving information, their learning would be improved. So to break down these four categories, we have visual learners who learn from movies, pictures, graphs, diagrams, that kind of stuff. Oral or auditory learners, I'm gonna say auditory from now on because when you hear oral, it's just, auditory makes more logical sense to me, so that's the one that we're gonna use. Also because auto captions will spell it right. Who learn from music and discussions and lectures. Reading and writing learners who learn from making lists, reading textbooks, taking notes, and kinesthetic learners who learn from experiments and hands-on activities. A 2016 study by the National Council on Teacher Equality found that 67% of teacher preparation programs required students to incorporate learning styles into lesson planning assignments, and 59% of textbooks advised taking students' learning styles into account. Those lessons appear to stick. A 2017 study examining the prevalence of neuromyths found that of the 598 educators surveyed, 76% agreed that individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style, and 71% agreed that children have learning styles that are dominated by particular senses. According to a 2012 survey, a 2015 and 2016 study, and a 2020 study, over 90% of teachers believe that this is an effective teaching tool, not just in the US, but also in like Australia, New Zealand, and European countries. Studies have also shown that learning styles are perceived as a sort of identity thing that many educators feel is hardwired into students, and even genetic, like if their parents are kinesthetic learners, the kid will be as well. All of which to say, how the heck did I get through education stuff? To be fair, I didn't do the student teaching program because I wasn't getting a teacher licensure, so I missed a lot of it, but still, and not come in contact with these concepts at all. Like, I'm really confused. I did reach out to other education students from my college, and they said that they did learn about it, so maybe I just missed it. I don't know. I'm just confused because statistically I should have come across it. Anyway, there's little to no evidence as to the existence of distinct learning styles, and the meshing hypothesis was debunked in 2015. And debunked several times since then. In researching for this video alone, I read about 12 to 15 different articles about, and about 8 to 10 different academic articles, and every single one of them talked about the exact same pieces of what is wrong with the learning style system and debunked from the learning style system, but every single one of them used completely different sources to back up their point, which, how is there so much literature on the ineffectiveness of learning styles in this? Anyway, it's wild to me. There's kind of 4 different points where it comes to debunking the existence of learning styles. The first is that neurologically the mechanism of learning is the same regardless of the mode in which the information is presented. Yes, we process things differently in different parts of the brain, but if your auditory system is activated and processing information, your other systems are also being activated and are at work as well. Some people do have better skills in different areas. For example, somebody with an auditory processing disorder may have better visual memory because they have an easier time taking in that information, but the point of learning in a classroom is very rarely what do you see or what do you hear. It is what is the meaning of this information, which is absorbed and stored the same regardless of modality. An example used in a TEDx talk that I watched was a study with professional chess players who, on a test of showing a chessboard to them for a short period of time for them to memorize versus showing chess novices the same board, the chess players did memorize a lot more of the board, but when pieces were randomly arranged, not in accordance with how the game works, they both memorized the same amount of chess pieces because the professional chess players saw meaning in the original boards. They understood the strategy of what was going on behind that board and how they would actively utilize it were they to be playing the game, so they remembered it better than people who just don't know how chess works. Doesn't mean that they have better visual memory, it just means that they had a better understanding of chess. The second piece is that somebody's learning style is a preference, not necessarily a genuine strength. If learning styles are a surefire thing, we should be able to see in studies that visual learners learn information better when receiving it visually, but do worse when learning auditorially, and vice versa for an oral learner. But when this is studied, time and time again, there is no difference in learning whether they're learning with their supposed learning style or a mismatched learning style. And we also see that when students learn multimodally, aka with more than one learning style at once, they learn better than when isolated to just one style. There's also a study done about studying methods that found that the majority of students do not prefer to study in a way that aligns with their perceived learning style, so students know this without knowing this. And if you want to see this type of study in real time, Veritaserum has a video on learning styles where he does an informal experiment on people in the street that perfectly encapsulates how this works. So if you want to see research in real time rather than have to read a research paper to understand it, I will link it in the card above for you. Now, learning styles are also not the consistent thing that they claim to be. The idea of a learning style is that you are that learning style throughout all of your education. But in a class like music, you're probably going to be an auditory learner because it's about listening. But in math, you may be a visual learner because you need to be able to visualize the numbers to make it easier to tackle the equation. And you may be a hands-on learner in gym class because playing tennis makes more sense than having somebody explain to you how to play tennis. And the last thing is that if there were some credence to the theory of learning styles, there would probably be some semblance of uniformity or definitiveness. And the fact that there are 71 different frameworks of learning styles, none of which are definitive or solidly backed up by research, or if they are, a lot of the research is biased, not peer-reviewed, or poorly structured, is a major red flag. Which brings us back to VARK. I thought it would be fun to take the VARK test to see what kind of learning style it assigned to me, and so I found the website, and the website looks like somebody published one of the Microsoft PowerPoints I made for fun in 6th grade and then copyrighted it, which is a fascinating choice, really. I said this to my friend, this doesn't matter, but it does. I sent it to my friend with the text, hey, can I introduce you to the VARK website? I keep looking at it and it's getting worse, and they responded, right off the bat, don't like these design choices, feels like I'm about to be scammed. Also, my other friend asked me if it was possible to murder a website. So, you know, I try to keep my videos as objectively academic as I can, but good lord, this website is too funny to not comment on. It's like bright blue and bright green block letters. Some of them have drop shadows, some of them don't. It's on light gray. Everything's either entirely capitalized or entirely lowercase. There's no in between. If you go into any page other than the home page, it puts a giant thing on the right telling you that your cart is empty, with various quotes from people about how effective VARK was for them and or their classroom that are only denoted by their first name. And the page that's titled Reliability and Validity in the menu, when you click on it, is titled Validity and Reliability of the VARK questionnaire. Once you click on it, I don't know why they switched the words. How did nobody? Anyway, this website feels like if the internet had liminal spaces. I hope that makes sense. We're gonna get back to the validity reliability page in just a moment, but first I want to mention that the other pages that give information about what VARK is and how it works are so very carefully worded so as to tiptoe around the immense amount of research as to how ineffective VARK is. It feels kind of slimy to read it. I'm not a fan of that. And it also seems to have changed its ideals to be a little bit more like, teachers don't need to change how they teach to accommodate students. We never said that. That's a bad use of the teacher's time, which is one of the major critiques of the system. Instead, students should be using it to help them change how they go about learning, but then still sells resources and tools primarily for the teachers anyway. It also sometimes calls them learning preferences, sometimes calls them definitive permanent learning styles, as if they're not quite sure which of the two they want to believe that it is, or maybe more research came out and they edited some pages and not others, so now it's inconsistent. I don't know. Also, it talks a lot, starting very recently, about multimodal learners, specifically like people who fit in multiple VARK profiles and need to learn how to learn multimodally, which I would argue is just learning, because all learning is multimodal and should be. And based on the research we talked about earlier, technically multimodal learning and learning style learning are fundamentally opposing concepts, and multimodal learning should be the primary type of learning. So I feel like they just threw that in there to try to like line up with modern research without getting rid of their original concept, because they couldn't back down on it because their whole brand is called VARK. The validity reliability page, or reliability validity page, depending on which titles you want to look at. Also, I actually do want to pause for a second before I continue to rail on this website. I don't normally judge about construction of things or about language of things because, right, like a lot of those things are disability specific, and, you know, judging how people word things can relate to disabilities, and I try not to judge about that. However, this is an education group. Their whole job is education. Their whole focus is education and not accessible education. There's no mention of disability anywhere, and they're structured like this, and they're making simple mistakes like this, and that is as a company, something I'm concerned about. If it was an individual, I wouldn't be bothered by a lot of this, but I'm bothered by it because they're a company that's selling stuff. The reliability validity section of the website says, researchers may want information on the statistical validity and reliability of the VARK questionnaire. Dr. Walter Leita from the Research and Evaluation Methodology Program at the University of Florida has conducted a study of VARK. The paper provides evidence of the validity of the VARK for measuring learning preferences and also presents its limitations. The paper is published and the citation is, and then the link for the article is, followed by the abstract reads, and then the word validity followed by some text, and the word reliability followed by some text. My computer would not open that link because it says it's not a secure site, so I pulled up the paper myself and I'm confused. So they do list the abstract after the validity piece of it. That is the abstract of the paper. For me, reading that abstract, it does say that the estimated reliability coefficients were adequate and the study found preliminary support for their validity, followed by mentions of potential problems with the test itself. The fact that the only study they have linked there as to the potential effectiveness of their questionnaire is both 14 years old and only shows preliminary support for validity is interesting to me and weird. And then the second section, after the reliability text, is a section of the results portion of the paper with some words added to kind of make it seem like it was part of the wider abstract of the paper, which, who wrote those extra words? Was it the researchers? Was it the VARK people? I don't know. The extra words don't have a whole lot of meaning, but it does feel weird, especially in that they did not reference that this is from a different section of the academic paper. This may be standard practice, and I've never come across anybody doing this with research ever before, but it does feel a bit unsettling and uneasy to me. I don't love it. Maybe I was just biased going into this. That could very well be the case because I'd already read the research about how ineffective this is, but it just feels a little fishy and not necessarily backed up by a plethora of solid evidence to me. I'm not totally buying it. And also, when the entire scientific community knows that, but it's not mentioned at all anywhere on your website, that feels like you're hiding the truth to sell me something. And while yes, the VARK toolkit is free for use in schools and universities, they still sell a lot of books and stuff. There is a huge market for hiring people to teach professional developments about learning styles. We're going to talk about that in a hot second. Now, looking at the discussion with VARK's creator, Neil Fleming, and David Baum, who's a higher education consultant from 2006, they quote a professor by the name of Dr. Marilys Finicky, who wrote, "We found that VARK was hard to validate statistically, including with several modifications we tried and several statistical strategies such as multidimensional scaling. We just couldn't get a good fit with the data. This does not mean that the instrument itself is not valid or desirable, but it shouldn't be used in research. That is not its strength. Its strength lies in its educational value for helping people think about their learning in multiple ways and giving them options they might not have considered. The statistical properties are not stable enough to satisfy the requirements of research, but then one of our findings is that no one has been able to design an instrument along these lines that does. So VARK is in good company. Everyone who uses the VARK loves it, and that's a great thing to be able to say. So it's obviously striking a chord with almost everyone who uses it. We just have to recognize that the constructs of learning style are too varied to pin down accurately, and every instrument I've ever considered suffers from this same issue." Which is super interesting because there are some things about education that are fundamentally untestable. Like, test scores do not indicate intelligence because the concept of intelligence itself is so wishy-washy and unclear and subjective that it is impossible. But in this case, it's not just that they couldn't majorly validate VARK statistically in research. It's that tons of studies have been unable to validate it as a useful tool, and that has been the case since the inception of the concept in the early 20th century. And we also have data proving that VARK is actively harmful to learning and education. So if we have no solid data of it being good and actual solid data of it being harmful, I'm inclined, in general, using a tool that has no scientific proof that it helps and some scientific proof that it may hurt, but saying that you see that it works implies some semblance of confirmation bias, aka I'm looking for positive changes, so I'm seeing those positive changes. I'm not doubting that these people have not seen positive changes in their students, but I am doubting whether those positive changes are because of VARK, and are probably more likely because the teachers are more energized to use a new thing that they think is going to help, and it makes them excited and therefore more engaged and therefore engaging when they finally start using this as a tool. To be fair, some of the more prominent research as to this fact came out well after this conversation took place in 2006, but I do think that it is an important thing to note. I also want to talk about the questionnaire itself for a hot second, because it's not subtle. Like, let's look at question 1, shall we? I'm sorry, I feel like I'm railing on this thing and I shouldn't be railing on it that hard, but I'm having fun. I hope that you are too. So question 1, when finding my way, I, A, rely on paper maps or GPS maps, B, rely on verbal instructions from GPS or from someone traveling with me, C, I like to read instructions from GPS or instructions that have been written. Or D, head in a general direction to see if I can find my destination without instructions. I'm not looking at maps while I'm driving, I will crash my car. That doesn't mean that I'm not a visual learner, it just... Anyway, question 2, when I'm learning, I A, read books, articles, and handouts. B, see patterns in things. C, like to talk things through. D, use examples and applications. I feel like you're supposed to know your learning style before you take the test. And also, my answer to all of these is it depends on the situation, or all of the above. There's a different questionnaire for younger people that is a little bit less on the nose, but it's still pretty on the nose, which requires you to already understand how you learn in order to understand how you learn via the VERK process, which is supposed to help you tailor your learning to how you understand how you learn. What? That just feels like extra steps. It makes sense why this is popular, right? Like, it fits in line with how humans like to have solid boxes to understand things because it makes us feel more in control, which is in line with how we've looked at personality and cognition for millennia. So of course we're gonna find some new version of seeing something in life that way and feel like it makes logical sense. It acknowledges that there are many different kinds of people who have different kinds of needs in the classroom. A lot of people, when it comes to the debunking of the learning styles myth, treat this debunking as some sort of personal offense in that we're saying that all learners are the same, which is not fundamentally what we're saying. And like I talked about earlier, there is a serious confirmation bias here. If you think that you're an auditory learner and you listen to a lot of podcasts while you do the dishes and you learn things from them, but you struggle to sit down and read an academic text, that's going to further your thinking that you're an auditory learner. The other main reason that it's popular is because of capitalism. For example, the Institute for Learning Styles Research, where you can become a certified multimodal paired associate's learning test practitioner for just $1,895, claims that there are in fact 7 different perceptual styles. A lot of these 71 different learning style systems are trying to sell you books on it. They're trying to sell you courses, they're trying to get paid to give professional developments about it. It's a very lucrative business decision. And if a certain idea makes people money, they're going to continue to push the idea and push it really hard to the point where it feels like it must be objectively correct and must be based in fact. I'm looking at you, got milk situation, but in reality, learning styles waste a lot of time and a lot of resources that could be better used elsewhere. Those professional development hours spent on learning styles could instead be spent on, say, learning about accessible or universal education, for example. Not that I have any stake in that. The money could go to more resources for the classroom rather than textbooks about learning styles. The teachers can focus on making classes engaging for everybody at the same time rather than trying to create 3 or 4 different lessons for each individual learning style, which means that they're going to be teaching better, will be less exhausted, and will also be able to cover more information in the entire class period because they're not trying to split things up. Learning styles, as I said earlier, also cause active harm. According to a 2023 study published in Nature, we found that parents, teachers, and children aged 6 to 12 were more likely to say that visual learners had higher intelligence than hands-on learners. They guessed that they were more likely to get better grades, and they were more likely to succeed in core subjects like math and English, while hands-on learners were more likely to do worse, be less intelligent, and to succeed at non-core subjects such as music and art. And as we talked about earlier, most teachers think that these learning styles are innate and that they are fixed, that they cannot be changed, and they're somewhat genetic, which means that they're already assuming a particular outcome from their students without realizing it. And being able to look at students and see change and possibility in them is one of the most important parts of being an effective teacher. Labeling types of learners has been shown to limit students and teachers alike, preventing the use of different kinds of teaching strategies and making students hesitant to engage or try to learn when the information is not presented in the way that they think that they learn. Someone who believes they're a visual learner now has a ready-made excuse for why they cannot pay attention during lectures and why they don't do well on tests and lecture courses. Similarly, those who think they are tactile kinesthetic learners quickly come to believe they cannot learn new things unless they're working with their hands. What began as a sort of, hey, if you struggle with this, that's okay, you don't need to be amazing at everything, you can succeed at something else, which is very well-meaning, has made it so that students are less likely to strive for the things that challenge them, and we're teaching actively maladaptive strategies for learning and creating self-fulfilling prophecies of our students, especially when young kids get this label from an authority figure at a very young age and take it as an unquestionable fact. And reading that research, right, made me look back at my experience as a 5th grader with this concept and my time as a student afterwards in a completely different light, because I told my teacher I only learned from reading books when it was quiet. And she told me that that wasn't going to happen and I needed to get over it. But the reason I was only learning content from books was because I was reading about things that were intrinsically interesting to me and took my brain out of the classroom that was always too loud and too bright and too overwhelming, and I didn't understand the social interactions that were going on. I was probably being bullied half the time and didn't realize it. But I didn't have the language to explain that at the time. And since I was told this is how you learn, and also you're never going to be allowed to do that in a school setting, I stopped engaging. When I didn't understand something, I just taught it to myself, often outside of the classroom. And I got caught for reading under my table very quickly, so I stopped doing that and I started maladaptive daydreaming to imagine my way out of the classroom into a deeply detached point that I'd still, you know, struggle with. And for the rest of my education, I've taught myself everything outside of the classroom via books, via my own research, and used class time to do other things, whether that was doing quiet training sessions with the service dog puppy that I was training at the time, working on my YouTube videos. I used to caption in class all the time, and I now really struggle with captioning because I don't have class time to do it. I would organize my planner, I would journal, I would write my own stories, I would draw things, literally anything I could do to not pay attention to the lecture, because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do it, so what was the point of trying? And that made me really struggle in a theater education space because it's always hands-on, so I wasn't allowed to use those tools to dissociate from the classroom, and I wasn't comfortable being present in a classroom because I hadn't done it since the 5th grade. Now obviously I don't think all of this is a direct result of my 5th grade teacher telling me my learning style was to get over it, but it almost definitively started that ball rolling. And I often talk about how, as a disabled person, I cannot learn in a classroom, and I know many of my peers feel the same. And I still think that that is a true statement because it is hard to learn in an environment where the lights are always too bright, the chairs are always too uncomfortable. As a lip reader, I usually can't see the lecturer's lips the entire time. They're wearing a mask. I'm not super riveted, so it becomes too exhausting and not necessarily rewarding for me to try to follow along the entire time. That's incompatible with the ability to learn because you need to relax to be able to learn. And generally using the majority of your energy just to try to figure out what's happening and also not scream means that you don't have the extra space to relax into what's happening and absorb it and expand your mind. And that has nothing to do with learning styles. That's just the inaccessibility of the education system overall. But what I also think is interesting to me is that in situations working in theater where it is structured the exact same way effectively, like we have dramaturg lectures and stuff, I gave dramaturg lectures, I have no problem paying attention and following along because I'm in a business that I adore and I'm doing things that I love to do, so it's easier for me to stay focused and stay engaged, even when the learning going on does not match the learning style that I thought that I had. And I remember as a student struggling so much in school and feeling stupid and useless, only for all those things I could never do in a classroom become easy once they became a part of my passion projects. I was actually talking about this a few weeks ago with a friend who's a professor. We had virtual coffee. It was great. It was a good time. And we were talking about what we would do hypothetically if we had me as a student, because I'm stubborn. I need to understand why I'm putting my energy into a thing if I'm going to do it, which in a theater classroom setting, a lot of that is meant to be left up to interpretation. Let the actor experiment to play around with their body mind and figure out what to do with it without structure. I like structure. I like to create and experiment better within structure. That's what works for me, and that's fine, and theater classes don't offer that. But we were talking about how the only way to learn in that setting is to not brute force yourself into loosening up and relaxing and going with the flow, but rather take the time to understand, like, what are my priorities? Why am I here? What is the goal of this? What is my identity as a learner and my goals from being in this space? And what do I want to get out of this experience? And in reflecting on that, I feel quite solid about having completely checked out in many of my classes and just needing to get by for a degree. And in others, I now wish that I had used that as a reminder, right, of what the goal of it all was, and tried to exist in that learning environment a bit more and stepped out of my comfort zone a bit more. Because at the end of the day, while we act like our education system is meant to cram your head full of information, it's really about the other 90%. The socio-emotional growth, the building of confidence and independence, learning to think critically, learning how you learn and what you love to learn about so that you can pursue that in the future. But this is hard, particularly for minority students who have a lot of active barriers in the classroom. And those barriers are not going to be fixed by catering to some non-existent learning style, right? It comes from understanding when a classroom is inaccessible to its students, whether that's physical accessibility or other kinds of care, like understanding the fact that sometimes students are dealing with things at home that make it harder to focus, or being sure to gender and name people properly, or not platforming deeply offensive and outdated research that dehumanizes minority people, which is just the psych field, basically. Explaining what's going on in the classroom, and oh look, we found our way back to trauma-informed practices. I know that you've missed me talking about trauma-informed practices. That's my whole brand. I will link my video about those. I don't know if I'll have any cards left above, but I will link it on the end screen if you do want to check it out, because they're basically the #1 easiest thing you can do for accessible education. They're really easy to implement and also usually free to implement, so get on that, teachers. But what I find most interesting about all of this learning style stuff is that it kind of did to classrooms what IEPs are doing to classrooms, and we're talking about how they're impractical. They're forcing teachers to create several different versions of the same lesson rather than creating a multimodal version to the same lesson to get better, to be able to better integrate all the students together and to learn together. But we don't majorly talk about how the IEP system is also kind of impractical in that it's structured to sort of split the class up based on different kinds of learning styles. That is significantly more based on science, so the comparison here doesn't entirely work, but hear me out, I'm going somewhere with this. if we're talking about the issues of isolating the needs of different students and how that negatively impacts the classroom, why hasn't disability education as a conversation come up when we're talking about the myth of learning styles? Because I would argue that the proof of their ineffectiveness, the self-fulfilling prophecies, the act of harm, is argument enough that focus on creating wholly accessible classrooms makes more sense from a teaching perspective and a learning perspective than creating the typical classroom structure and the accessible version of the same class structure that is specific to every single individual disabled student, rather than working on integrating them together. And I'm not saying that I require full integration because these things are complicated. I'm also not saying we should get rid of IEPs because we're not there yet. But I had many college professors structure their classes in a way that eliminated the need for almost all of the most common academic accommodations across the board, and it helped everybody to learn better. We know it helps everybody learn better. We have data on it. And again, I know it doesn't entirely compare, like it doesn't entirely compare with each other, but this very much feels like two sides of the same coin to me from an accessible education perspective. But in regards to things that do work for teaching rather than learning styles, and also for learning, if this is blowing your mind as a student and you're like, ah, shoot, how do I get through the rest of my education? The first answer is all of accessible education, which you can watch my series on, which helps both students and teachers figure out what the heck they're doing and how to make things accessible to them, but also understanding how the mechanisms of learning work are really, really helpful. The primary things that come up in various articles were connecting previous knowledge to the new knowledge being taught to help teach things. I do this with my videos a lot. The more I learn about various topics, the more I create like a massive web of intertwined knowledge that helps me better understand other pieces of other things better. And now when I learn new things, they just slot into place and stick in a way that they never really did before. Or even like here, right, where I took the experience of being assigned a learning style, which you may have personal experience with, to teach you about accessible education, which you may not know about, right? Like I brought you on that educational journey. Learning itself as a concept requires actively thinking about how you think and how you learn. It requires metacognition, and it also requires the ability to fully use and understand the material. So find ways to work with it. Find ways to reflect on how you're working with this material, what's working, what's not working. Like I teach everything that I learn to you guys, right? Which means that I have to firmly understand it and be able to pick it up and move it around and look at it from every single little different angle, and also connect it into my knowledge web in order to feel comfortable teaching it to you guys. And so I learn this information because I have to. These videos stick with me in a way that the majority of the things that I studied in my education have not stuck at all whatsoever. Learning also requires sustained attention and a desire to learn things, meaning that it has to be interesting and engaging. We can make things engaging by presenting them in a really fun way, like a cool film with gorgeous music and graphics, or by telling a fun personal anecdote that you connect to, or by combining lots of different modalities of learning so that you can return to it in different ways to repeat it in your brain in a way that feels somewhat new and interesting every single time you return to it. You can also cheat code this a bit by connecting it to something you're super invested in, super interested in. I have an uncanny ability to link everything to disability because, let's face it, everything's related to disability. But that's how I got myself to read 2 Jane Austen books a few weeks ago. It's how I got myself to read 20 different articles for this. It's how I learned a ton about Pompeii for my Pompeii final, that I really did pay attention to that class and didn't learn anything, and I'm really sorry, but I just like, I struggled with that, but then I learned all of the content in like 2 weeks to make that video because suddenly I was connecting the history of Pompeii to disability and archaeology, and I suddenly became really interested in it, and I wanted to learn that information, and I was able to learn it. And also, like, I somehow have become a Shakespeare scholar for that workshop that I worked on. One of my core character traits is that I hate Shakespeare, and yet suddenly I'm open to reading and enjoying his stuff within that new context, and I'm doing more Shakespeare stuff, and that's wild. That is such a powerful, important tool. But at the end of the day, I think what we can learn most from all of this is that critical thinking is really cool. We love critical thinking in this house, and questioning why things are and who might potentially gain from the success of a certain kind of narrative. Also, studies and data are really cool because just because something feels like it kind of maybe works doesn't necessarily mean that it actually does work, and or that it's not actively causing harm on some level, and or trying to sell you something in this case. But yeah, that's all I got for this video. Let me know what your learning style is in the comments. Mine's all of them because they aren't real and not how brains work. Oh, also all my sources are in the description. As always, if you want to check them out, forgot to say that. So if you want to double check all this proof, you're welcome to. Good practice to learn how to read research papers when you already know what the results of them are from somebody else explaining them to you. If you read the abstracts and the results and you already know what they're going to say before you read them, it can help you learn how to read other research papers in a different context without somebody explaining it to you. Pro tip. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.